Welcome to Questions for the Modern World, a Common Home TV podcast. In today's episode, we're honored to speak with Kathryn Joyce, a political science lecturer, author, investigative journalist, and the current editor at In These Times magazine. Our discussion focuses on her recent Vanity Fair article titled Behind the Catholic Rights, Celebrity Conversion Industrial Complex. We provide a link to this article in our notes. We explore some of the more extreme movements within the United States, as well as look at well-funded American Catholic media and their impact on the church. We hope you enjoy. Kathryn Joyce, welcome to Common Home TV.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you're based right now in the Adirondacks?
I am. Yeah. So forgive me, I've got a little bit of a far north cold right now, so if I sound froggy, that's why.
No, being from Montreal, I'm actually really jealous. The UK has Corfu in Greece, and the Australians go to Bali. Montrealers have Plattsburgh. And the fact that you're so close to, I don't know, the best place in New York State, a little bit jealous.
Plattsburgh?
Before I ask, I guess, a stand-up question, can you give us a definition of what is a groper? Because that's going to be like the first thing. And I think a lot of our listeners wouldn't even know what that alludes to.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's gone beyond U.S. borders, but the groper movement, it is an overwhelmingly young male white nationalist movement here in the United States. Groypers are pretty much by definitions followers of this young influencer named Nick Fuentes, whose name might be familiar to people because he has been in some high-profile controversies over the last few years. He is a live streamer in his mid-20s, who's best known for saying, the most kind of dragged from the sewer horrible things that you can imagine. He is a Holocaust denier. He is a very avid white nationalist and white supremacist. He is an extreme misogynist. He has said bigoted things about just about any group that you can think of, and in really extreme ways. And this being 2024, that has made him quite a popular figure in some corners of the internet. So he has become a major influencer among especially young men on the far right, though, not entirely exclusively. We just had another mass shooting recently here in the US, and the young woman who committed it this time apparently was something of a groper follower herself, even though it's a very explicitly misogynist movement. So that's what the groypers are about. And it's also often really infused with this sort of caricatured version of conservative Christianity and really kind of explicitly right-wing Catholicism in particular. So that's kind of one of the flavorings of the groper movement, is they make a lot of these arguments, these white nationalist arguments, using Catholic imagery, imagery from the Crusades, sort of this medieval Europe aesthetic that they sort of fuse with all of these bigoted movements.
Well, can you give us an example of some of the language that they use in like symbolism, perhaps the Christ the King, because we had that Candace Owens, and so to a lot of our listeners would hear Christ the King and they would never make an association with a negative response, because to them, saying Christ the King is not an explicit your religion is worse. Pope Francis just came out and said all religions are paths to peace, and even followers of someone like Pope Francis would hear Christ is King, and it would just be like, oh, that's terminology that seems very milquetoast, right?
Yeah. So they tend to say Christ is King rather than Christ the King. And I'm definitely aware that is a term that has a much deeper legacy within the church, and a much more complicated one. It's one that they have adapted and online have turned into a hashtag that has become kind of associated with their movements. So it's not to devalue the phrase as a whole, but just to observe that this is a phrase that has been picked up.
Like it's a dog whistle to their movement, right? It's a dog whistle to their movement, would you say? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's Christ is king is it's used, frequently in, you know, as sort of a riposte to kind of insinuate something anti-Semitic, which is again not to say that anytime anybody says that it is anti-Semitic, but it does have this kind of loaded history that they're tapping into. And I think um, the first time that I wrote about the Catholic Rite was a little more than 4 years ago in the context of the 2020 election. And at that time, I spoke to a number of really sharp Catholic writers and journalists who had been observing the sort of merging of kind of right wing Catholicism with the alt right that had been going on, at least since 2016 and probably back a little bit further too. And there had been this process by which the alt-right, which we don't even really use that phrase anymore, it's kind of broken into all of these more specific movements. But the alt-right in the first Trump election, 2016, and in the years afterwards, was I think this was in the words of Christopher White, really sharp Catholic journalist, that the alt-right was borrowing sort of all of this Catholic imagery and language and context to lend a sort of soul to their political movement. They wanted to give it um, a bit of kind of gravitas and make it seem something deeper than it was, just this white nationalist movement. Instead, this is something about reclaiming, everything that has been lost, everything in European history that we're going to kind of reclaim as, this nativist, white nationalist, white supremacist movement. And we're going to symbolize all of that by putting up kind of crusader images all over Twitter and, writing kind of Deus Vult in our, Twitter bios and Christ is King everywhere. And kind of, so it became this process of really kind of integrating kind of this super right wing political movement with these tokens of the faith that pretty much have been stripped of their meaning and any other kind of deeper context, but bringing them in to kind of give an artificial depth to their movement. So I think that what we can see, the modern version of that, modern as compared to 2016 or 2017, but a few years later, the groypers are very much have been doing the same thing. They
You,
are tapping into these images and this rhetoric and these you know all of this stuff that is freighted with deep meaning and history and context, and they're using it to make you know what they otherwise say, which is a bunch of slurs and attacking people to give it like a little bit more soul.
guess Catholic platforms like EWTN and Word on Fire shape the future of Catholicism in America, but their reach is a little bit more global. Like in other Western countries, we have that effect. People like to really pretend that they don't, like, oh, that's America. And it's like, but is it though? Because they're very powerful movements. Can you tell us a little bit about how they shape the future of Catholicism in America or how they mold it?
Yeah, I mean, I think both are tremendously influential, media outlets and media ministries, kind of however they both kind of view themselves to that to one extent or another. Um, and I think they have, probably, greater reach, than many officials like statements and positions of the church at this point. That's what a number of kind of scholars that I spoke to were pointing out. They were making the argument that the the official hierarchy of the church is no longer really the body that is directing kind of the the body of the church here in the United States. That this is something that has increasingly kind of been more of a lay-led movement. And you could see this in different ways. Back last spring for us, I guess fall for you all. Um, there was a commencement address at a Catholic college in Kansas, here in the U.S., and there was a very prominent NFL football player who gave the commencement address at this small conservative Catholic school, and it was very controversial because he made this really strident graduation speech calling on women to embrace their roles as, homemakers and mothers, and, saying this is going to be much more fulfilling than anything that they could possibly find in the world of work, or, pursuing a career related to what they had been studying in school. And in the aftermath of that, some observers here in the US were saying what's really interesting about this Harrison boot care movement is, that this is the influence of kind of Catholic laity leading the church in a direction, more so than the actual Catholic hierarchy. So that's a bit of a tangent. But I think to say massive media ministries like EWTN and Word on Fire now, they have this reach that really exceeds that of a lot of the kind of official structures within the church. So I think on one hand, it's just size and influence is really massive and impressive, and that's carrying a lot of weight. And on the other, I think that there are pretty conservative messages coming from both of these. I mean, EWTN has been pretty highly critical of Pope Francis for a long time, and that's been coming through in a lot of their coverage. And then Word on Fire, I think, has been, I was surprised in doing this reporting, just to see kind of how much it seemed to be aligning itself, not just with conservative Catholic celebrities, but also non-Catholic celebrities who are nonetheless coming to take on this role of influence within U.S. Catholic culture. So people like Jordan Peterson, the Word on Fire website, back this summer when we were kind of going over and fact checking all of the numbers again before the piece went to print, there were dozens. I think there were something like 70 different entries on Word on Fire that were related to Jordan Peterson. So the role that a massive media ministry like Word on Fire has in elevating a figure like Jordan Peterson specifically to a Catholic audience, I think is really notable. I mean, Jordan Peterson, he's also obviously extremely famous on his own. He would be famous without Word on Fire, but Word on Fire is kind of giving their imprimatur and, saying this is somebody who has something to teach American Catholics. We should be listening to him. And then the things that he has to say, frankly, are incoherent to
Right.
pretty dangerous in my opinion. And I'm not saying this as a Catholic, but he is making a lot of arguments about Christianity and about Catholicism, and and about Pope Francis, lots of criticisms there, while being unwilling to declare his own beliefs in any regard. So it seems to me, observing from outside of the church, he's really trying to have it both ways. And so I think Word on Fire has really helped elevate his position and that of some other people like him.
Well, that's very interesting. Anecdotally, like my best buddy here in Melbourne, right? He lives down the street, comes over all the time, and he is an ex-Muslim, now atheist. I would label him more agnostic because we have chats all the time. And one of his things is like he sends his kid to the Catholic school. And I was like, my dude, we have had this conversation. You are not a fan of any religious institution. He goes, yeah, but like I go online a lot and I hear all the people talking, and they're not going to do the gender ideology there. So it's like, hey, I might not be Catholic, I may might even hate religious institutions, but I hear the dog whistling going around that I want to be a part of, and I want to be a part of that because it's against this thing that so it's drawing in, like you said, and I think that was mentioned in your article as well. You had Lafferty, I believe his name is, in Canada, who mentioned something like in that same vein. Now, I have to take a deep breath because we're talking about Dr. Peterson. But I'd like to say something just to get off my own chest. This thing that he does when he talks to himself, if you've ever noticed, this is one of the wildest grifter moves. He'll be in a lecture hall and he'll talk and he'll go, I have this hyper individualistic, angry vision. And the left has this vision. And then he puts his hand up and he goes, I'm a fair and balanced, impartial person. Let me just do the math. And he talks to himself like he's doing all these machinations on the left to give them their fair due. And guess what? In the end, he was right all along. And I'm just like, that, or what are we watching? And another thing, before I get to my Peterson question that I find, you said it, I'm so happy, is that like, what are you saying? One of my favorite intellects of my life is a political activist, right? Prior to being a political activist, he changed modern linguistics.
Wow.
And he doesn't sound like that when he speaks. He uses multisyllabic words, but he's not talking about the postmodern more like adding old Nazi words, not understanding political terminology, making up all of these adventures. And then when you go like, what are you talking about? He can just sit back and laugh and go, you don't understand how smart I am. And I'm just like, wait a minute. What is going on here? So now I will ask you a question. Thank you for allowing me to indulge a portion. And I can only ask one question. I was going to bring up Russell Brand as well, but as somebody who's just trying to be forgiveness and mercy filled, I don't know if you saw what he did to Manuel from Faulty Towers.
I did not. No.
Please don't. So I don't think I could even give him a fair shake. I'm still so
Okay.
unimpressed with his behavior and his, pending sex crimes. But as we get back to Jordan Peterson, it's fascinating how Jordan Peterson seems to oscillate between advocating for a strict fundamentalist Christian view, where women should avoid makeup or revealing clothing to prevent tempting men into sin, but also behaving like a randy old man commenting on scantily clad Maxim models online, depending on his mood or sexual desire. He promotes a return to traditional masculinity while often breaking into tears in the slightest whim. How do these movements reconcile such a contradictory duality of the high traditional mass where everything's dignified and everyone, and then getting home on the internet and going, big women are not getting me going? Like, what is going on here? How do they hold those two together?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. And I probably don't have a really satisfying answer to it. Um, though, I guess my only answer is that, as I was reporting and definitely, reading more of and listening to more of Jordan Peterson, talking on podcasts than I've ever had occasion to do before, or, may hopefully in the future. But yeah, I think the anger towards women seems to be coming through in a lot of ways with a lot of aspects of this movement. Um, and I think, you know, how can you reconcile, you know, saying this woman's not hot enough for me, and also like this woman's too slutty for, for me or for society. I mean, it's misogyny. I mean, like there's always been kind of that duality in expressions of misogyny, I think. And I feel like one of the takeaways that I had most in reporting on this, as I was going, I did not set off thinking that I was going to be particularly writing a lot about um, kind of young men and young male attitudes, at least here in the US. And that just really seemed to emerge as a through line, that there was this drumbeat message on, you've got to get more young men back into the church. And, the ways that we're going to do this in part are going to be, reaching out to these influencers who have all this sway among young men, including Candace Owens, who has, a very large male fan base as well, not exclusively. Uh, but the ways in which that was being kind of shaded, not just with this sense of young men feel adrift, they need something to anchor them. Maybe the church can provide that, which would be one message. But instead, this very angry message, that is, saying, the church is controlled by women. It's feminized. The vision of Jesus is hyper feminized. We need a really masculine Jesus. I mean, this was something that was in Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire interview with the actor Shia LaBeouf about his conversion. They had this whole long conversation about how um, LaBeouf, ended up feeling like he could convert when he realized there was this really like macho fighting, sword carrying Jesus that um, he could look to and try to emulate, instead of, this sort of weak, almost Buddhist Jesus that he had been, he thought that he had learned about as a child. And that, mixed with the intense misogyny that comes out of the groper movement, really seemed concerning to me. And as you kind of go out into kind of the medium lands of, like, not a podcast that doesn't have, say, the reach of EWTN or Word on Fire, but is certainly much more mainstream than the Groypers, and you have kind of these large audience podcasts here in the US that are explicitly focused on Catholic topics, and they are, bringing guests on who are making these really extremely, not just patriarchal, but very kind of angry, gendered appeals to young men on their shows. That really struck me as, oh, this is a thing that's happening. Is there's this very angry appeal to a group of young men that a lot of them already are, kind of because of internet culture, um, being drawn into these kind of misogynistic patterns. And then, to see some of these sort of parachurch organizations and outlets that are surrounding the Catholic Church here in the US uh, really explicitly try to tap into that and try to reach that market by meeting them where their emotions are. Um, that seemed really concerning to me. So that is probably an unsatisfying way to answer your question of, how does Jordan Peterson get away with,
But I
speaking
think
out
it leads into a pretty
about
good
that?
segue. I think it leads into a pretty good segue of like, what is the counter pushback? Because this comes from, like, if you look at the amount of men going to universities, and again, I'll give you a couple of anecdotal things just on my end, right? Like, I have friends that have come. I remember being back in Montreal. One of my buddies came. I know him really well. He played football with me, and he was by no means like a bully jock or anything like that. Right? He knows that my politics leads to further left than what a liberal would be, right? And he just came to me and said, I was at the camp the other day and I made a comment and these people were yelling at me. And the comment actually was quite innocuous. When I heard it, I was like, is that what you said? He's like, yeah. It's like, and these people like were dogpiling on me, and you could just see this really like really nice guy just being like, I'm feel under attack. And I've had that too. A drummer in my old band too is like, why do people hate me? And he's kind of asking me because he knows that I'm outspoken, my political beliefs are, I'm not shy to tell them, right? And you have this sort of lost people that feel that they're being under attack. And then you have these Pied Pipers which that's why I call them Jordan Peterson are sort of Pied Pipers, and the Trump movement. But they're finding something. So like I'm currently writing an article and it's called The Latin Mass Has Something to Offer. Now that in itself is a bit clickbaity because it offers me nothing. I see it for the pernicious movement it is, but I see disenfranchised people saying like, hey, here I don't feel like just because I'm a white dude, I'm terrible. Just because I'm a white male, and the reaction to this in the form of Catholic media, I find is lacking because we don't have a counter movement to provide for this. Well, we do have, and you named a lot of great journalists, a lot of people I follow, and a lot of people, my fellow Catholic journalists that I've had conversations online with, that they love to talk about when something, one of Strickland says something lunacy and they promote it. And then that's how they're getting clicks to their websites, right? That's how everyone's getting clicks to the website. And that's fine because surely he did say something that was, not just untoward, but like probably pretty, not rational, pretty crazy. But that alone won't get you back that center of men that feel disenfranchised. So, do you see anyone in Catholic media or Catholic organizations when you were doing this research that were trying to push back against this narrative in a way that wasn't just like polarized?
That's a really great question. And I feel like I should be able to point to something because I've benefited so much from so much of the work that people are doing in these outlets and these spheres. And I mean, I guess as a journalist, I hope this doesn't sound like a weaselly answer, but I do think explanation and promoting understanding is doing something, and it's kind of the start of doing anything that matters. Is you have to understand kind of what you're up against. But I understand, yeah, I mean, like there is I'm sure a risk of do we become at any point kind of just similar to the secular media, where there's Fox News, and then there are the outlets that are countering misinformation that is coming from Fox News or coming from Donald Trump. I mean, I think it's very easy to get caught up in that.
So we've had Massimo Fajoli, who you quoted in your article, on Common Home TV before, and he stated that criticism coming from some circles in the United States has franchises in Rome and like globally. So it's an asymmetrical war within the church. What global impact do you think these type of far right movements have? Because there's legitimate criticism for posts that's completely, I think, acceptable, right? That's understandable and acceptable. But I think when you talk about people like Strickland, you're not talking about good faith arguments. And when you're talking about people like Steve Bannon, I don't think that you're coming to the table with fair changing ideas. So how do you think that these type of really dedicated people have affected the broader church with their money and their influence?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Boy, I feel like Massimo would probably have very smart thoughts on this. It makes me think, when I first spoke to him was back in 2020 for a prior Vanity Fair article I was doing about the Catholic right and in the US. And at the time, Massimo had made some arguments that really stuck with me about how isolated the US church was becoming within global Catholicism because of kind of the ferocity of its right wing and the direction it was taking the church. In 2020, that was, quite a year in a lot of different ways, and also the kind of the civil war feeling within the Catholic Church here in the US in 2020 felt really extreme in 2020 in a way that it seems to feel differently now. Maybe just because it's kind of continued to progress and it is driving out, seemingly, some people who are really turned off by that kind of MAGA identification. So I think that's one thing that I heard, when I was talking to people about it, is that, you know, Catholicism is global. It's this much, much larger community, and this really particular kind of American, you know, almost schismatic kind of feeling within the Catholic Church in the US, is not something that's being replicated as much, elsewhere in the world. That was an argument that was being made to me back in 2020. Um, you know, a few years later, 4 years later, yeah, I don't know whether or not, that's like, it seems like things maybe have changed a bit. I mean, I think that, in a number of European countries, we are seeing the rise of far right movements that are intertwining themselves with religion, much has been happening in the US for decades and decades, but particularly in recent years. And I do think, you are seeing, versions of that sort of, um, extreme right-wing Catholicism being used, in service of some of those kind of modern far-right movements in different European countries, whether that is in France or in Poland, or elsewhere. So I think it's, it's not a given, how anything is going to turn out. But I mean, there does seem to be kind of an Americanization of a lot of politics, elsewhere in the world lately, it seems. And unfortunately, like, it seems like a lot of our bad habits, have kind of leaked out beyond our borders, and, the way our politics gets conducted seems to have spread a lot since 2020. Um,
It's a shame. It's a shame I believe that's true. You see it less so when you say you're right. Like, it's the word Catholic literally translates to universal, right? It's a universal church. I work in Asia, Philippines, Singapore, or places I frequent for church, and it's not the same. They see the states as very much like what's going on there. That's very, and the African church too might have like conservative leanings and like, but this thing that's happening in the states, um and it might lead to no longer being the center. When we had John Paul II, it was very much, fighting communism. Oh geez, Reagan's involved, we're all, and it was like the darling. But now you see papal appointments to bishops and cardinals from places like Palestine and Iran, South America and Asia, and he seems to be shifting the power. And I think that is something that is going to be very hard to ingest as an American church, because it no longer puts you in the role of leadership. Do you think that there's any chance of that leading further to pushing people towards, or do you think that there will be eventually an acceptance that they're no longer just going to have as much power as in previous decades, generations?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like there is, in even since the US election, rather than kind of dying down, I feel like I have seen a bit of an escalation of, really kind of fighting rhetoric from the Catholic right figures here in the US, who have been criticizing Pope Francis for a while. There's kind of some, more strident comments being made by some of these sort of misfit leaders, than they had made in the past, in terms of how they're characterizing, the Pope, or, talking, more broadly about, church leaders as being on the wrong path. So I feel like they're not they're not turning down the heat on the rhetoric. If anything, some of these people seem to be um, just kind of ramping things back up to kind of a level of hostility that is closer to what there was in 2019, 2020, when things felt, extremely tenuous. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, like there's a huge amount of anger. There is one of the things that I wrote about in my piece was this sort of odd thing that's happening within US Catholicism, but also within US evangelicalism more broadly. And I think, in some other country contexts as well, where religious identification and political identification are becoming extremely porous categories. And so people have, this was an observation made by a scholar some years ago that some of Trump supporters were starting to identify as evangelical simply as a political category, to state, this is my ideological leanings and not the fact that I consider myself a born again Christian. Um, and, there seems to be a number of signs that people are kind of taking to Catholicism in a similar way. It's becoming, for some people, certainly not as a blanket statement, but for some people are adopting it as a political identifier, rather than, this is actually my personal faith. Um, so I think when you get to that place, like these things, everything starts to be defined in terms of politics. This group Catholics for Catholics that I wrote about, I mean, like part of its entire, reason for being is to say that Republican politicians who are not Catholic are still better Catholics than Democratic Catholics here in the US. Um, and so I think if you're getting to this place where, religion is kind of a political category than an actual religious or faith category, when moves like that are sure to be interpreted through a political lens, making appointments from, places, in the global south, or from developing countries, is, certainly seems like it's going to be interpreted by, this right-wing Catholic community as an attack on what they see as true Catholicism, which seems like it's, becoming ever more closely identified, not, with politics, and because our politics, here in the US and unfortunately in a number of other places these days are increasingly kind of ethno-nationalistic politics, it's getting interpreted in that way as well. So, if you have, you know, new bishops being appointed or cardinals being appointed from, non-Western countries, then this starts to be politicized as well.
I was really taken. I didn't know much about this. So when I was researching sort of your past, I came up with child catchers, rescue trafficking, and the new gospel of adoption. And that's just, it's to me, it was fascinating. So how has evangelical adoption movement used the concept of orphan theology to promote adoption as a religious mission?
Yeah, sure. So that book of mine, it's getting to be a bit old. It came out in 2013. So a lot of this is reporting that was done between 2008 and 2012, 2013, though I did keep reporting on this afterwards. But at that time, particularly here in the US, there was an adoption movement that arose within, a large kind of percentage of the evangelical community. And I'm a religion reporter, so before I was reporting on the Catholic right, I was often reporting on um, evangelical movements and subcultures as well. So this this movement, and it was extremely popular. It it was promoted in some of the largest megachurches and most influential megachurches in the United States. Rick Warren of Saddleback Church, he was a really significant leader within it. The Southern Baptist Convention, which is the second largest denomination in the U.S. after only Catholicism, they passed a resolution calling on people to get involved in this. So it was this idea that there are X number of orphans in the world, and kind of an asterisk next to orphans, because how you define that is really the crux of the whole problem. And there's X number of Christians, and if we can just put these two things together, we're going to solve this global orphan crisis. And the asterisk there is that, this was a movement that was rallying, mostly middle class, mostly white evangelical Americans to adopt. And, at least at first, overwhelmingly, the focus was on international adoptions. So that was what was getting kind of the most publicity, and kind of driving the most interest within this church and also without it. And so you had, huge numbers of, American Christians signing up to adopt from countries like Haiti or Ethiopia, or Uganda or China or Guatemala. And one of the issues with international adoption is that a lot of the times the demand that's coming from wealthy Western countries has this really kind of distorting effect on the realities within that country. And so this kind of creates this market situation where, because a lot of the children who get labeled orphans are not orphans in the Charles Dickens sense of the word. They're not orphans in the way that most people colloquially use the term, which would be to say a child who has lost both parents and is alone in the world. The way that number actually has been defined and the way it was getting used, or the numbers that were being referenced by this movement, were referencing an international definition that just said any child who has lost one parent or both, and regardless of whether or not they were living with extended family or other guardians, are going to be considered orphans. So there was this kind of mismatch of the idea of the need that was out there, but then there was all of this Western money that was being poured into developing nations that created a demand that kind of then prompted the need for somebody to come up with a supply. So in a lot of different countries, you started to see these really kind of terrible ethical kind of missteps taking place, and kind of being fueled by a lot of money and a lot of good intentions from America in particular and a number of other European countries. But to take Ethiopia as one example, because I reported from there, one of the things that happened was, as there was all of this U.S. interest in adopting as a religious mission Ethiopian orphaned children, you started having these middlemen who would go around from village to village in Ethiopia, and were saying, like, who would like their child to go receive an education in the U.S. And if you would, please come stand over here. We're going to do a video interview with your kid. And then these video interviews are shown to U.S. prospective adoptive parents, who think that, they are helping a destitute, alone child. And then the Ethiopian parents, because a lot of the times these children have parents, they're just very poor. They think they're sending their child to get, a leg up in life, but not that they are dissolving their paternal bonds with them. And you end up with these really tragic situations, where, families that are kind of intact, but poor and vulnerable, get broken up in order to meet, the need of Western adoptive parents, who very often think that they are, saving a child, who has no other options. And, this is not the case with every single adoption, but it was the case with enough of them that country after country, um, as the Christian adoption movement really got rolling, ended up having to put the brakes on their own adoption programs and either suspend them or shut them down entirely in order to kind of get to the bottom of some of these ethical quandaries. So the fact that there's kind of deep ethical issues within adoption, international adoption, or domestic adoption is kind of one thing. The fact that within the US evangelical community, this got turned into a religious movement just kind of added a lot more momentum and a lot more demand to that issue. So it started kind of creating this bottleneck of a problem that really kind of came to a head in, the early 2010s, around the time that I was writing about it. That was
Can you tell us
probably
what is the Great Commission and how does that approach affect both, well, maybe the international aspect of this story?
Yeah. Well, as the Christian adoption movement got going, this was a movement that was led by a lot of pastors, a number of theologians, influential Christians who were thought leaders within their communities. So, of course, a lot of them started writing books to promote this movement, to explain this movement, to get more people behind it. And one of the things that a number of people talked about was the idea that by adopting, this could be another means of evangelicals fulfilling the Great Commission, which is, the mandate to go and evangelize the nations, to kind of to spread the good news, to make other people, to bring other people into the church, and into the faith. And so it was an interesting, to say the least, and I think in many contexts troubling, application of that idea, which is the Great Commission. That is a mandate to convert, to go convert the nations. To apply that to the idea of adopting children into your family is to say, and the people who are writing, this library that developed of orphan theology books, to say that you are also carrying out the Great Commission by adopting children, is to say that, one of the ways that you can fulfill that obligation to go and convert non-Christians is to bring those non-Christians or putatively non-Christians into your family and convert them there. So that ends up being, a troubling motivation to be adopting children for. And it also it led to some of the people who were writing the theology that guided this movement saying things like, while it's all good and well to be adopting a child so that you can feed them and clothe them and take care of them, the much more important mission here is that you are, converting them, that you are turning them into to Christians. So that, I do not think that was the guiding motivation for most of the average people who got involved in this movement. I think, most of the adoptive parents or prospective adoptive parents who got involved, either they wanted to start their family or to grow their family, or they were motivated by wanting to help children in need. And then, some of the problems that came from this, in my opinion, were of making this a mass movement, because then kind of the focus is on numbers, on kind of achieving as many adoptions as possible. And when that's your focus, then you start, kind of downplaying some of those ethical quandaries that are kind of at the heart of a lot of adoption, which is, could this child stay with their family if their family was given a little more help? if their family had $500 to, to get a roof over their heads, or, here in the US to buy a car seat, to get home from the hospital, would they be able to keep their child and raise their child that way? And a lot of times, what adoption has done, not always, of course, but in too many instances, adoption has happened because the family that the child is coming from is vulnerable, is poor, is going through a hard time.
Since you published a decade ago, have you followed the trajectory? Has there been any laws passed? Is this something that has become to the forefront, and any sort of regulation that you know of that has kind of stepped in since?
Things have changed a lot in the US, and globally. In terms of international adoptions, so many countries ended up suspending or closing their adoption programs over the last 15 years or so, that international adoption figures really just fell off of a cliff. The international adoption field of, children who are kind of moving from one country to another is a small fraction of what it was 20 years ago. And so that in and of itself has radically changed what adoption looks like now. It's no longer really practical to have a movement calling for mass adoptions if there's no longer, tens of thousands of children coming into the United States each year to be adopted. And instead, it's a matter of, low thousands and even, hundreds rather. So that kind of sucked the wind out of the sails of this movement, probably more than anything. There have been laws kind of over time that have tried to enact some safeguards, some of which have, had more teeth than others. There is something called the Hague Convention that is supposed to lay out standards to, kind of make more orderly and ethical some of these processes. So it's kind of a question of how much each country requires adoption agencies that are registered within it to abide by those, is part of the issue. But I do think the numbers part is really just the massive change. There's just many, many fewer adoptions taking place. And I do have to say, in fairness, that also the evangelical adoption movement, I think, did do some self-reflecting and look at the fact that a lot of what, a lot of the focus on adopting children from overseas in order to build this kind of, more multiracial, orphan theology focused church in the US, that was bringing probably more problems than benefits. And a lot of them have, a lot of the organizations that were part of this movement have shifted their focus to trying to do things to, support care for children within their countries, in developing countries, instead of, focusing on adopting, a handful of those children to the US. So there has been some change there for sure.
Well, I'd like to thank you and have everyone at Common Home TV. Kathryn, it's been a really pleasure, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Cheers.
Happy New Year.
Thanks for joining us on Questions for the Modern World, a Common Home TV podcast. Early in the episode, Kathryn mentioned Christopher White. She meant to say Christopher Lamb, both excellent Catholic journalists. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like and subscribe. Find us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, go gently.